a special edition of World Insight with Tian Wei on the G20 Summit.
Hello and welcome to a World at a Crossroad, the G20 special edition of World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The leaders of the world's 20 emerging and developed economies are gathering in Argentina. An urgent agenda, but divided views ranging from world economic growth to global governance and geopolitics. Take a look.
The G20, or the Group of 20, an international bloc made up of governments and central bank governors from economic powerhouses in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The grouping dates back to 1999. It was convened for leaders to discuss international finance policy and address issues that go beyond the responsibilities of any one organization. The members enjoy 60% of the world's land area and 2/3 of the global population. G20 economies account for around 85% of the world's economy, accounting for nearly 75% of the world's trade. The heads of government and heads of state of the group have met annually ever since 2008. The leaders have focused particularly on international economic cooperation since that year's international financial crisis. The group's agenda has expanded, and it now also hosts separate meetings for finance ministers and foreign ministers. This year's gathering in the Argentine capital of Buenos Aires marks the summit's 10th anniversary. Under the theme of building consensus for fair and sustainable development, the G20 leaders are expected to share their views in the fields of trade and investment, digital economy, infrastructure, and climate change.
So, with all of these topics on the agenda, can differences be resolved? In our program today, a panel of 4 will debate it out. Meet Zhang Gong, who is a professor from the University of International Business and Economics. Also in Beijing, Bruno Roche, co-creator of the Mutuality in Business Lab at Oxford University, also advisor to former French president on the G20 issue. In Philadelphia, we have Jeffrey Garrett, who is the dean at the Wharton School and the Reliance Professor of Management and Private Enterprise. Last but not least, in Buenos Aires, we have Martin Redrado, who is an economist and former president of the Central Bank of Argentina. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to have all of you on our program. I want to start by asking Mr. Redrado, it's in Argentina, so you know the agenda the best, but the question is, agenda in abundance, can agreement in abundance also at the end of the day?
Well, I'm looking forward that the leaders have focus, because the G20, and as you know, as a central bank governor, I've been part of these meetings for 5 times. When you are spreading in too many issues like climate change, immigration, trade, investment, you lack focus. And this group was effective when it focused on getting us out of the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. So I hope that instead of looking at a broad set of issues, we cannot be all things to all people in just 48 hours, that the leaders focus in just 1 or 2 issues. For me, it's critical that for the world economy in the next downturn, we prepare to invest in infrastructure.
Okay.
And that's a need for China, that's a need for South Africa, that's a need for the United States. So that's a common theme where there could be agreement in terms of the investment that we need.
All right, Professor Garrett, what about you? Do you think there's 1 or 2 points that you want to put your fingers on? Or rather, there has to be a wide range of agenda? After all, they only meet once every year for the G20.
Well, look, I agree with the central bank governor that infrastructure is in desperate need all around the world. I think the good news there is that it actually doesn't require a lot of coordination. Governments could just commit, in essence, to their own infrastructure plans. I think Belt and Road Initiative looms very large, of course. But on the broader issues, the central bank governor was right that the G20 did incredibly effective collective action after the financial crisis in 2009. Since then, it hasn't done so much. I think this summit, though, obviously everybody's going to be looking at the bilateral meetings, with in particular the meeting between President Trump and President Xi being the one that the world is looking for.
What about for you, Mr. Roche? I mean, you used to work as an advisor for the former French president on G20 issue, but things are getting ever more complicated since then.
That's true. The G20, especially 10 years ago, has been set up to handle the financial crisis. And we are 10 years now after the crisis. And despite hundreds of initiatives, books, forums, great initiatives like the ATG, for instance, we are still in a situation where it is the economy and society which is in service of the economy, and the economy is in service of finance. And the role of finance actually has not been sorted out yet. And I think that one of the major challenges we're going to face over the next decade, I think we're going to start with this 2020, is the dysfunction of the financial system, which is actually at the root of many of the issues we deal with. Inequality, global warming, etc.
Dysfunctioning of the current financial system. You see that as the root cause, but you're dragging our conversation to an even deeper root. Yet, will the leaders be able to handle that? I mean, within the 48 hours, we already hear in our background through our Argentina participant, you know, the helicopters and the cars are coming in piles. So certainly it's quite a show over there, but at the same time, real issues has to be worked out, at least to a certain extent. Professor Gong.
I think among the couple of issues that has been talked about, I think there is a problem here that the United States disagrees with many countries on a lot of these issues. For example, immigration. For example, sustainability, an issue of climate change. You know, all these things, United States tend to take a quite different position here. But I think in the spirit of sort of cooperative relationship among these leading countries, I think at the end of the day, probably there will be some kind of agreement, but it's going to be very nominal and kind of a hollow, I think. They will keep talking about sustainability and inclusiveness, but to be honest, sustainability means many things to a lot of people. So I think they probably will only agree to that extent and probably disagree on many of the substance of these issues. Well, you know, that's the beauty of the communique, isn't it? You just use a very abstract words and everybody could sign on it, and you have to do that from time to time. Having said that, though, one of the things is extremely important. You see a lot of bilateral also taking place on the sidelines of the G20. Mr. Garrett, China-U.S., of course, is one of those. Russia-U.S. has been cancelled as far as we know so far. Meanwhile, you also heard right before our show, U.S., Mexico, Canada, the so-called USMCA signed their agreement, even though that has to be approved eventually by their legislature next year. So what about that trade agreement? Is that something that Donald Trump is trying to show to the rest of the world? See, I got my first deal.
I think definitely yes, and of course what we know about President Trump is that he's really allergic to multilateralism as a concept, so he wants to do much smaller deals. Even in renegotiating NAFTA, he actually did it as two bilaterals, a bilateral agreement with Canada and one with Mexico. I think from the world standpoint, you know, one of the interesting things in that agreement is it talks about the inability of Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. to sign trade agreements with so-called non-market economies. And of course, most people think that the non-market economy there was really referring to China, which means there's a big tie-in between the NAFTA 2.0 and the path forward on the ongoing trade war between China and the U.S.
Professor Gong, I have to go to you, because China's name is being popped up.
Yeah, I think the dean was referring to Article 32.10, and I probably view this even in a larger context. I think the USMCA is probably the beginning of Donald Trump's endeavor to essentially establish a WTO 2.0, on the sideline, proudly targeting China. I think he is going to shuffle Article 32.10 down to the Japanese during the negotiation with them. Maybe European is a little bit difficult, but if you count all these countries together, they have this article targeting China. Pretty much it's building another WTO, and China is not part of it. And that's a sign that it's very dangerous for China. I think our government...
It's dangerous probably for everybody. If you look at the USMCA deal, Mr. Redrado, since you're coming from the continent of America, you see when it was being signed, the Canadian Prime Minister refused to hold the binder in front of him in, quote-unquote, a sign of celebration. He was trying to suggest to the U.S. President that, tariff issue has not been sorted out between Canada and the U.S. yet, even though Mexico and the U.S. could be quite happy about the final deal. So, Mr. Redrado, you see a lot of differences when it comes to trade, not just between China and the U.S., but on many multilateral platforms, mainly with the U.S. involved.
Well, unfortunately, I think that multilateralism is dead, and this is even before Donald Trump came to the presidency of the United States. As you know, the Doha round, the round of multilateral negotiation that started in 2002, really could not advance on the real issues. So unfortunately, we have sort of a spaghetti bowl of on one side, one country, on one side, the other country, or regional. So we are looking at a world of bi-regionals, bilateral trade, or plurilateral trade. I think that we should focus also on the trade of the 21st century, which is basically digital trade, the trade of services. So maybe we should be more modest in terms of our goals, in particular coming from small or medium-sized countries like the countries in Latin America. We're representing here 3 countries, which is Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, which are part of the G20. So clearly we are all for multilateralism, but the level playing field is not there, so we need to be as agile as possible to make trade deals with all of the world.
Well, trade deal is only one thing, Mr. Raj. As you may know, French President Macron is having some disagreement with some of the countries from Latin America when it comes to the climate change issue. So we see one thing added up to another. Can we expect anything?
I think the context also changed profoundly over the last 20 years. Power shifted to some extent from government to business, and also power shifted from traditional economy to the digital economy. So we have new players now in the context in which we operate, and therefore the relationship between these powers, being nation states or large organizations, large businesses, has to be organized differently. So I hope, actually, it is my hope that there will still be a framework that would actually bring this power together, but you can't put new wine into an old wineskin. And actually, to some extent, the old system had a purpose for a time, but it needs to be reformed profoundly.
Right. Well, for a French, it's about the new wine into the old bottle. We don't want that to happen. But for the other cultures, it's probably different analogies. We're going to talk about those analogies and certainly the content of the G20 after this break. You're watching A World at a Crossroads, a special program on the G20 summit going on in Buenos Aires. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching A World at a Crossroads, our special edition of the G20 Summit. I'm Tian Wei. A World at a Crossroads. 10 years ago, in the wake of the financial crisis, it was U.S. President George W. Bush, together with others, who gathered world leaders, which gave birth to the current G20 framework. 10 years later, the current American President Donald Trump, though, seems to be, as some say, be more of a divider rather than a unifier with his America First policy.
Because it's America first for me. It's all about America first. We're not going to give up hundreds of billions of dollars in orders and let Russia, China, and everybody else have them. It's all about, for me, very simple. It's America first.
Well, how many times we're going to hear that? As the world's second largest economy and a beneficiary of globalization, China, though, is firmly in the pro-multilateralism league. Chinese President Xi Jinping has been reiterating many times the country's commitment to cooperation and openness around the world. For example,
we should say no to protectionism and unilateralism, uphold the WTO-centered multilateral trading system, make economic globalization more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial to all, and expand converging interests and shared opportunities through opening up and cooperation.
That is an excerpt coming from his speech at this year's APEC meeting. President Xi also pointed out the urgency to improve the efficiency of the global governance system. International organizations, including the WTO, IMF, the World Bank, are all looking at ways to reform, but the question is whether they can change fast enough and efficient enough to stay relevant. Will this year's G20 give way to the rising tide of nationalism, or can it pull countries back together on the road to multilateralism? Let's come back to our panel of four wisdom gentlemen. So let me go to you, Professor Garrett, first. What about that? Will multilateralism being put a question mark this time, or it will be further confirmed by most of the economies at the G20?
Well, I think the reality has already been stated, which is that large-scale multilateralism, big international organizations have basically failed to be able to reach agreement, and I think that's understandable in a world of 200 countries. So an institution like the G20 held more promise. It's broader. It includes emerging markets, unlike the G7, but it's much smaller than the IMF, United Nations, World Bank. So G20 is not a bad forum, but I think this G20 in particular is going to be a lot about bilateralism, minilateralism, not at the G20 level. And of course, Donald Trump does lead that. I was in Davos in January 2017 when President Xi gave a very robust defense of globalization and China's commitment to it. And of course, in a context in which the newly inaugurated President Trump chose to send nobody to the World Economic Forum. So I don't think we'll see a lot of tangible progress, but I think it is clearly an opportunity for President Xi to position himself as a global champion of globalization.
Professor Gong, of course, being the global champion is one thing. However, get things done could be another thing, particularly if it involves many other players. Professor Gong, what about multilateralism for signature of China?
I'm a little bit hesitant to hurry to announce the death penalty for the multilateralism. I think it's still very much alive. I think the WTO itself, in a way, is a particular form of multilateralism in that it requires any agenda to be approved by each every one of its countries. And that is appears to be a very difficult approach these days. And then as you can see, mentioned in Doha round that not much of an announcement has been made so far. So I think definitely WTO itself needs reform. Right. But that doesn't mean that multilateralism is dead. I think for one purpose, for example, the dispute resolution process, it's clearly very effective at WTO for the last few years, right? So this kind of a function is not going to be available at G20. G20 is not a real governance system. It's sort of an advocacy platform where people can come in, the leaders can come in and coordinate policies. So I think there's a clear distinction here.
Exactly. It is where the policies are being coordinated, ideas are being exchanged about how global governance, when it comes to idea-wise, can be done. But that is crucial right now, Mr. Roche. If you look at the challenges we are facing, of course, reforms about international institutions and platforms all requires what principles are we applying to it, who should be involved, what process is the most appropriate. But when you see crisis coming up next year with WTO appellate body without judges almost anymore, in other words, you don't have dispute mechanism anymore. And then you also have the trade wars going on among some of the economies, not just China, U.S., but even Canada and the U.S. when it comes to tariffs and any other things. And Europe now, you also need to figure out after Brexit, if there is one, what to do next. Between Germany, and France, different vision as well. So multilateralism, to you, what does that mean?
It's interesting to see actually that it is the Anglo-Saxon world that invented multilateralism and globalization, and now they are pulling out and actually building the world on other nations to take a lead in organizing the world affairs. And I think I would like to also to say a few things that actually, of course, the multilateralism implies working with nations, but we are also dealing now with other organizations which to some extent are bigger than nations, and we are talking here of multinational corporations. Over the last 50 years, it's one of the most striking phenomena that actually many multinational corporations now have a GDP which is higher than many nation states. So there is a new form of power coming up which actually needs to be organized to the same level that nation states are organized. But the principles that actually
So you're adding more complication to the already existing challenge we're talking about, more players, as you
Indeed,
said.
yes, indeed. And we cannot ignore these players because these players actually to some extent have more power and influence than many nation states because they are the truly operating on the global level. Many nations are limited to play within their borders. Multinational corporations are the true players of globalization.
This is a very interesting thought. Mr. Redrado, obviously your colleague is trying to suggest that, you know, the G20, of course, is a leader of the 19 countries plus the EU together. They are not necessarily the players now, as we see it, where the world is moving on with, but only a small part of it, as he argues. Mr. Redrado, what do you think?
Well, it is clear that these countries have around 80% of world trade, so their decisions matter to their own people and to the fate of the international economy. So what you do in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of monetary policy, does have an effect. But I would divide that, yes, this is more a body where you could dialogue or where you could coordinate, but then each one has to execute in its own country. And the other issue is what happens with the multilateral governance systems, and I would divide the international financial institutions with the world trade institutions, in particular the WTO. On the finance areas, I mean by the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Well, all these banks need to have more capital. In order to face the challenges that we have ahead, what we need to increase is our quotas in these institutions in order that they could have more effect in any crisis that we could have ahead or in any downturn that we could have ahead. In the case of the WTO, there is clearly a governance problem, and you have, I am a member of the dispute settlement unit, of a panel member in the dispute settlement unit, which is probably the only body that at this point is being respected worldwide, but it's clearly that in terms of world negotiations, world trade negotiations, there is a governance problem. There are many countries that don't want a multilateral deal, so we need to focus on small is beautiful, on services, on cyber technology, these issues that are part of world trade at this point.
Professor Gong, starting with at least some common ground. That's what Mr. Redrado is trying to say.
I think we probably should avoid positioning WTO as sort of as a opposite of the so-called spaghetti boat of bilateral trade agreements. I think WTO is going through reform. And look at the European Union's reform agenda proposal. They've already mentioned alternative ways of pushing these, from a procedural perspective, ways to advance some of the proposals here. So China also has put out a reform proposal here. So I think it's not something that can be addressed. I mean, there are ways to improve the process and improve its effectiveness.
Right. Of course, there will be a lot of bilateral, multilateral negotiations and discussions going on during the G20. But Professor Garrett, do you think at the backdrop, there's the big thing of geopolitics, as some say? It's not just multinational, multilateralism that we're debating around, but rather, the cause of the debate for the so-called multilateralism. Where is geopolitics, do you think, for this year's G20?
Well, look, I think in terms of my adult lifetime, the rise of China, or maybe the re-rise of China, is probably the biggest thing that's happened in my adult life, along with internet and mobile technology. But of course, the rise of China has been a very interesting thing. It's happened hand in glove with globalization of the economy. But at the same time, China's political system has stayed outside of the mainstream of the liberal democratic order. So we now have on the world stage, certainly from the American standpoint, I think, a China which looks like an economic challenger to the US the way Japan was 30 years ago, but also a potential geostrategic rival as the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. But I remain an optimist actually on geopolitics for the simple reason that China is so enmeshed with the global economy, so important to the global economy, that trying to so-called decouple China from the world economy is not only infeasible, it's unthinkable. If you did that, the world would go into, at minimum, a deep recession.
All right. I have to say, Professor Garrett, you still have a long way to go for your adult life, so you're only seeing part of the glamour now and the wonder for that period of time. So good luck to you, sir. But
maybe climate change. I'm thinking that the third thing will be climate change.
All right, then. Well, a lot of challenges for your adult life together with ours as well. So let's go to you, Mr. Raj, about that. Geopolitics. You know, is that going to be the real backdrop for this year's G20? I see a very serious face on, so help us to understand it.
Well, I think we are back into a Malthusian time, where eventually what matters is a demography. And let's put it this way, the US and Europe is only 10% of the world population. And actually it was the Western world which actually shaped globalization over the last 50 years. And it was only a tiny proportion of the world that actually had an impact on the agenda. Now we're moving into a much more Malthusian time when eventually it is demography that will matter. And being based here in China, and I agree with my predecessor, I think it's one of the most extraordinary sociological phenomenon, the rise of China, along with the digital economy, along with also with, in my view, the collapse of the current form of globalization. So yes, my serious look is really about to say yes, a complete new set of rules has to be reinvented, but most importantly, I think we need to interrogate the principle that will eventually drive the reorganization of globalization. And at the moment, we are back into a system which is pretty much based on competition, and also on the rise of nations against nations. I strongly believe that there is a higher level of organization which is based on reciprocity and mutuality, which actually is a form of principle which actually can drive the world, the business and nations into a higher place of peace and prosperity.
An important thought about that. And you also heard from China talking about community of shared future. Of course, that is a phrase. But exactly what kind of future are we looking at? Professor Gong, I have to go to you because the others see the rise of China as a gigantic phenomenon, a phenomenon that the others have never encountered before, and therefore there's nerves, there is, you know, a lot of anxieties. What about from China, the direction that you are reading from the recent developments in the past few months?
Well, I mean, historically, you know, people tend to view the rise of another power in the context of geopolitics. I mean, this is just the Western political thinking, traditional thinking. But I think what our government is proposing is a community of shared future. I think it has a historical background as well. I mean, if you look at the history, China has never ever colonized any country, has never ever does the things. For example, you know, we actually went to Africa. Mr. Zheng He, as you know, right, led a fleet of 300 ships, went to Africa. You know, 19 years earlier than Christopher Columbus discovered Caribbeans, and we didn't colonize people with slavery, with sugar plantation or coffee plantation. We didn't do any of these things, right? So, you know, our history doesn't really fit the kind of thinking that the geopolitical kind of school of international politics will entail.
Certainly history is something we should look at, and we're all students of history. We better be students of history. But you know, sometimes the history also helps us to understand during chaos, Mr. Ridrado, what should be done. In China, if I could just help us to understand a little bit of my country's history, there's something called the Warring States period of time. It lasts for a few hundred years. It was about different philosophical thoughts matched up with different kinds of small kingdoms, city-sized small kingdom. So if history could help us learn a little bit, are we in another, Warring States period of time where different countries are thinking at very different directions, but eventually with something we have to pull ourselves together? Can we, Mr. Ridrado?
Yes, I think that the common ground is how do we improve the well-being of our peoples, of Chinese, of Americans, of Europeans, of Latin Americans. So each one in this kind of meetings and in this exactly is life of our citizens. In particular, in this geopolitics that you're talking, in the dynamics between the US and China, clearly we are looking at convergent interests between the US and China that from a historic point of view doesn't mean that we will have increasing tensions to go into a military zone. And that's probably, the dynamics between the US and China is probably the single most important issue that we need to focus. As from a point of view of emerging markets, I always tell my Chinese colleagues that we see Chinese inclusion into the world economy as a little bit aggressive. What you've seen in Africa, what you've seen in some countries in Latin America is Chinese going after raw materials in order to feed their own industries. I think, advice, if I may, give to my colleagues in China is that as they spread abroad, that they think about creating employment in the countries where they want to deal with. How do we improve again the quality of the citizens in other emerging economies? Because, well, with the weight that China has and the capacity to extract raw materials and the need for money that our countries have, well, really that could be an unbalanced situation.
Right. Inclusive growth, isn't it? I think that is the terminology we better throw in here. Not just inclusive growth within a national boundary, but also inclusive growth worldwide.
Right. Well, and I totally agree that the way Chinese companies have been doing business in many countries still leaves a lot of room for improvement. I'm totally in agreement with that. But however, having said that, I think overall, we have to interpret our intention. We never had any sort of wicked design in the places we're going to. We never had any ulterior motivations other than really seeking mutual benefits and mutual interests. I mean, the trade is the fundamental piece that creates prosperity, creates wealth and jobs.
Everybody knows that.
Yeah. So,
everybody knows that.
So as long as we have those fair deals, as long as our investment in these countries take into consideration that create local jobs as opposed to just bring Chinese workers into those areas, I think we are still able to maintain a good relationship.
Mr. Roche, I have to go to you. At this critical juncture, people have a lot of questions. But should we have questions about some of the very fundamental common sense issues? For example, trade is good for everybody. There is shared interest. And on a multilateral basis, the world has to work. When we have doubts and uncertainties, should we also have doubts and also unclear messages about some of the very fundamental concepts with which the modern society is functioning? That, I guess, is also one of the questions that the state leaders coming from 19 economies and the EU has to face now. Mr. Roche.
Yes, is it a statement or a question?
It's both a statement and a question.
I think we have also to realize that actually the last 50 years have been built on the power of business. And the business is something which actually is an institution that existed before capitalism and probably will exist after capitalism. But we are in this parenthesis, which is in the financial capitalism period. And financial capitalism is based on one principle, which is actually the maximization of profits at the expense of the other. And I think we are reaching the end of this model, because not only it is no longer effective anymore, but it starts to be destructive. And the revisiting actually the modes of profit construction at the level of a business unit, from the smaller business unit to the largest multinational corporation, is actually a way to question the purpose of prosperity and actually the vision of inclusive growth.
There are a lot of fascinating thoughts flying around, gentlemen, with this conversation we're having. We still have a few minutes to go. Before that, let's take a look at some of the things we have prepared for you. The G20 members consist of developed countries such as the US, France, and Germany, as well as developing countries, emerging economies like China, Argentina, and Brazil, South Africa. And in the past few decades, emerging economies have become significant driving force of the global economic growth as well, while dealing with several challenges at the same time. Here are the numbers to bear in mind. Take a look.
According to this year's World Economic Outlook from the IMF, global growth is projected at 3.7% in 2018 and 2019. Growth in advanced economies will remain well above trend at 2.4% in 2018. In the meantime, with emerging Asia continuing to expand at a strong pace and activity in commodity exports firming, growth in the emerging market and developing economy group is set to remain steady at 4.7% in 2018 and 2019. It is not the first year those new economic powers are fueling the engine of global development. Also, according to the IMF, BRICS countries and other emerging markets and developing countries contributed 80% of global growth in 2016. And since 2006, China contributed most to global economic growth. However, some challenges did come with breakneck development. Many emerging markets and developing economies are suffering from country-specific factors: currency inflation, tighter financial conditions, geopolitical tensions, trade matters, and some other issues. To tame inflation, Argentina signed a deal in September to receive IMF financing worth $57 billion, the largest bailout in IMF history. And many of those developing countries have enacted reforms focusing on quality rather than the speed of growth.
All right, that's some of the numbers we want to share with you, because we want to discuss now some of the latest situation of the global economy, as well as those particularly from the emerging economies. With us once again, John Gong, Bruno Rauch, Jeffrey Garrett, and also Martin Ridrado. Let me begin with you, Mr. Ridrado. Briefly, we only have a few minutes left. What about the economic situation of the emerging economies? Will that be also a focus of this year's G20, as some of them have structural issues?
Well, it is evident that the course of interest rates in the U.S. is a critical element for all emerging economies. As you know, we depend on capital inflows from the developed world, from private pension funds, from private investors. So the fact that we have uncertainty on the course of interest rate, in my view, in the U.S. and in the Federal Reserve, there is a strict view about what is happening with inflation in that country, and in particular it's not taking into consideration the improvement in technology and how that flattens the possibility of further inflation. So how the Federal Reserve weighs the inflation outlook in the U.S., the relation between unemployment and inflation, if that creates more tension in terms of interest rates, that will clearly be detrimental to emerging markets. What we've seen in the last week from Federal Reserve Chairman is they are probably taking a pause because they are data dependent, and it is not clear that the U.S. has enough inflationary pressures to continue to increase interest rates.
Okay, Professor Gong, also briefly from you. China, for example, emerging economy, the debt issue and some of the sustainable development issue as well.
I think the interest rate in the U.S. probably affects China to a lesser extent. I think our country's foreign exchange reserve is large enough, is sizable enough to serve as a buffer to any shocks like this. But we have to admit that the economic pictures in China is starting to show signs of strain. I mean, we're starting to see statistics that exports are going down, and our especially with medium, small-sized business, private business, in the coastal areas, and we're starting to see these companies laying off people, right? So these are the things we have to worry about, and certainly from China's perspective, we hope the side talk here is going to work out.
Okay, right.
Yeah, so that would be my assessment here.
Professor Garrett, of course, you're based in the U.S., more polls are feeling about where Fed is going and the U.S. economy vis-a-vis the others, emerging ones especially.
Yeah, of course, many people around the world tend to be critical of Mr. Trump. In this case, Mr. Trump was the one who was critical of the Federal Reserve, arguing that they were raising interest rates too quickly, and it looks like he might have been effective this week. So that's probably good news in emerging markets. I think with respect to countries outside the Western world and outside China, the two biggest things really are U.S. monetary policy interest rates, but also the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, China's commitment to putting more than $1 trillion into infrastructure in emerging markets is an incredible opportunity for emerging markets to realize their full economic potential. But as we've already discussed, there have been some challenges along the way China has implemented investment in Africa, for instance. So there are some very big stories on the agenda right now. I just don't think they look like multilateralism the way we thought of it 10 or 20 years ago.
All right, before we go, every one of you, only one sentence, please, gentlemen. This year's G20, what is the focus you are looking at? Mr. Raj, one sentence for a Frenchman.
The fight against inequality.
All right. Mr. Gong.
A deal. The deal between China and U.S. is the big deal here.
Okay.
We're looking forward to that deal.
Mr. Ridrado.
Investment in infrastructure and the Chinese initiative around the world, the Belt and Road Initiative, that could benefit emerging economies.
All right, last but not least, Mr. Garrett.
A truce between China and the United States.
Oh my God. Wow, it seems that, gentlemen, you are putting our story, pushing to a pivotal moment already, making the headlines, certainly for all of us. A lot to expect. We hope the politicians will be able to work out, not just for their own sake, but also for the common interest, as they say many times, for the interests of the people. And that is all the time we have for today. World at a Crossroad, the G20 special edition of World Insight with me, Tian Wei. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. The weekend is up. Have a great one, everyone.